All right. So I hope we all had a good break, did a little bit of yoga, and maybe also came up with a few questions or a few thoughts on what aspects of working with the media that you are particularly interested in learning about, talking about. So I would suggest that before I start with the things I've prepared, that we do a quick round in the chat where you can just drop in any ideas you might have.
Can you remind us the question, Matt?
Which aspects of working with the media are particularly interesting to you? Which aspects would you like to learn more about? If there's nothing, that's fine. Then I'll just do, the things that I think might be important. But I do want to give people the chance to voice other things. Building trust. That's a good point. And one that I'll at least try to address in to some extent. Engaging communities, that one I think is going to be a bit difficult to cover today because it's, at least for me, because it's not something I've worked with a lot and have a lot of experience in. There are certain points in this second part that touch on that, but there might be other sessions where those points will be explored in more detail. I think engagement from your public, yes, definitely. All right, all of that sounds very good to me. I'll start this part about working with the media. The slide doesn't do what I want it to do, but I'll start with the same question again. Why? That's you might have noticed that's my favorite question to ask when it comes to communications. Again, if you're engaging with journalists, if you're working with media, again, your starting point should always be, why am I doing this? Couple of options why people tend to do media outreach. Sometimes it's to get media coverage or to be better known or to raise awareness. All of these things, I would argue, aren't necessarily really goals in and of themselves. They're more something you need to do in order to reach another goal. Because I would otherwise ask you, why do you want to be better known? Why do you want to reach new audiences? Why do you want to raise awareness? Sometimes people do media engagement, such as press releases, to satisfy a donor, because the donor expects it, because it was promised to them in the funding agreement, for instance. On this one, just one thing: if you can, never ever ever put any specific media goals into a funding agreement, because the media is not something you control. You cannot promise media coverage, and if you do, you're setting yourself up for problems. And even if you do get media coverage, your donor is almost certainly not going to be mentioned in your media coverage because it's not interesting to a journalist. The only reason the donor would be mentioned is if something went wrong, or if the donor is, I don't know, let's say a mining company that also happens to be mining the habitat of the species you're trying to protect. If they're somehow shady, or there's something shocking about who they are, then that's when the donor will get mentioned, but it will be negative attention. So satisfying donors is never, in my opinion, a good reason to do media engagement. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but it's good to be aware that it's probably not going to work the way that they would like it to. So maybe the answer to the question why could be, I need public awareness for a conservation issue because I want to put pressure on the government, as we, for instance, discussed just earlier. Let's say there's a campaign to turn a certain area into a protected area and not give it up to a development project. In such a case, media attention can be extremely useful because it brings in a topic to a higher level of consciousness, and it might lead decision makers to consider it differently, because now it's something that could become an issue for them in a re-election, for instance. Being aware of why you're doing it again helps you find the right way of doing it. For instance, we had an example a couple of years back in Mongolia where what's now Tost National Park was not protected. Very important snow leopard habitat where the coloring study happens, and it was under threat by mining interests. And one of the things that our team in Mongolia then did was a media campaign to raise awareness for this issue within Mongolia. They brought journalists there, they brought MPs to the area, and they were successful. The reason they were successful, other than their great work, is also that they chose the right way to do it. For instance, we had these discussions with them, and one thing that came out from them is that the Mongolian government at the time was not very open or wouldn't react very positively to outside pressure. So, for instance, having an article in the New York Times or National Geographic about this issue might potentially not have been positive, but it might have been counterproductive. So instead, the focus was on local national media in Mongolia. And the reason this worked was, among other things, that these things were planned strategically, and every step was kind of thought through. What are the consequences? What are we trying to achieve? And how can these people help us achieve our goal? If, on the other hand, your goal is to, let's say, raise the profile of an organization among a certain crowd of very wealthy people because you want them as high-level donors, it might be worth having an international media article in a publication that's relevant to them, whereas local coverage in your region's newspapers won't really help with that. So again, if you know why, you're almost halfway to how. One of the most common things that people think of when they think of media relations is a press release. Very often, working with media starts and ends at a press release in people's minds. And press releases can be very effective tools if they are used for the right purpose. Because again, a press release is not just, here's how I get attention from the media. A press release is a specific vehicle to share news with journalists, and not everything that is interesting should be turned into a press release, and not every press release serves the same purpose. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I think the first thing we should talk about is, what is news? This is usually not news. We talk about the news media for a particular reason, and that is that the journalists are very often looking for things that are new. New in the sense of they have not yet been reported on. They're new findings. Let's say you do a study, you find out that snow leopards are actually not solitary. They actually live in family groups. They're just hiding them. That's news. That's very interesting for a larger audience. And it can be treated as such. Whereas snow leopards are well adapted to cold mountain environments is not news, because everybody already knows it. It's sort of to be expected. So you don't do a press release about that. One thing worth mentioning here is news is only news as long as it's not known. Once, let's say you have a result, once that result is out in the public, be it on social media, be it in a newspaper, be it you present it at a public conference, it ceases to be news. For instance, the recent snow leopard population assessment in Mongolia that was completed, that's actually news. It's probably not news for international mainstream media, but for the conservation community, that's a good piece of news. However, the partners involved, a lot of them reported this news on their social media channels as soon as it came out, at which point it is no longer news for the media. You cannot do, or you can, but there's no point in doing a press release about something that you have already put on your social media 2 days earlier. So just have that in mind. If you have news, don't put them out until you're ready to put them out. You want to be the ones to break the news through the media. Just going to take a moment to look at the chat window if I can, because I see a lot of things coming in, but I can't read the chats. Maybe Costa or Justine, if there's anything in the chat, like a question or anything like that, you can just read that out, because I'm somehow failing to to reach it.
No worries. I think people were talking about more why they would engage with the media, and it was
okay.
beyond a neutral stance, calling for action, encouraging decision makers, engagement, and reaching interests of politicians, as you said. Sohail is bringing the point how religious preaching or religious stakeholders can also play a role in communication. And Nizar said engaging mainstream and local media and disseminating information can influence policies. So I think
yep, absolutely.
But Flavia has a question, and she's wondering, maybe Flavia, you want to ask directly? It's on to express yourself.
Hi, I'm not sure. Can you hear?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. No, I was just talking a little bit about elections because we frequently never think about conservation. So like, I think it's not necessarily now because of the presentation can go on, but when you think it's a good time, like to address how to reach politicians, or maybe how to reach understanding of how of that conservation can actually influence our lives, like in a daily, like day to day, right? Like because people usually are interested about like how can I feed myself, how can I get a job, and conservation goes behind. So usually, at least like in Brazil and other like poorer countries, especially now, people are not thinking about conservation very frequently, and that is influencing like pretty much very, very hardly. It's influencing conservation. So it's just a point.
Absolutely. Honestly, I think this is the biggest issue that we face as a community. It goes way beyond one species and how to protect it. It's, for instance, at IUCN, that's like our entire communication strategy is about that, pretty much, for the entire organization. How do we convey the point that our entire lives, our everything, our jobs, our food, our water, our air, everything depends on nature. So that's a very big question that I will only be able to say a few things about for us to discuss, but I'm glad you asked it, because I think it's a really, really important one. Here, I think we'll continue with something a little bit more simple, which is how to structure a press release if you do write a press release. A press release is first and foremost meant to raise interest among journalists. They're your first audience. You send it to journalists. They either find it interesting or they don't. And that decision happens within a few seconds. Very, very likely it happens in the subject line of the email already, or if you're lucky, they'll read a few lines. So what you need to do is capture them immediately. And the most important rule, I think, in writing for journalists, for the press, is your headline should contain the news, and it should contain results, not the process. For instance, if you do a snow leopard population estimate in Himachal Pradesh in India, let's say, and you finish that, your headline should never be, let's say, snow leopard population estimate completed in Himachal Pradesh. That's not a good headline. The headline should be Himachal Pradesh is home to 53 snow leopards, or however many. Make sure the headline contains your result, because what you did to achieve the result is interesting, but it's not the news. The news is what the result is. Second part that's important is your lead, that paragraph just under the headline, which is a couple of sentences. And again, it summarizes the news and why it matters. So for instance, in our case, it could be an estimated 53 snow leopards live in Himachal Pradesh according to the first ever assessment of the state's snow leopard population. You don't talk about background, you don't talk about who was the funder or who did the work. You do that further down, but here it's about why is it interesting? And so you give a summary of the news rather than, let's say, the Forest Department and Snow Leopard Trust in cooperation with Nature Conservation Foundation conducted blah, 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 blah. That can come further down, never at the beginning. What you also want is a quote from someone important, because journalists will want to, if they write about it, they'll want to quote somebody, and they might come and talk to you. But if you give them a good quote in a press release, they might also use that, which makes their life easier, and it gives you a great opportunity to bring home your messages. So make sure that your quote contains some of your key messaging, and it sort of contextualizes the news. It's like, what does it mean? Is 53 snow leopards in Himachal Pradesh surprisingly many, or is it actually shockingly few? Or is it, are we seeing an increase or a decrease? Those types of things would be great to put in a quote. And then you have your main text, which provides all these additional details, such as who did the work, who was involved, who was the funder, if you have to mention it. What's the larger context? Let's say snow leopards are, threatened species globally, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of the basic structure that I think works for any press release, whatever the topic may be, and that I would very much recommend to follow. And at the bottom, you put contact details. And you would be surprised how often people put contact details of someone who is actually not reachable at the time this thing comes out, or there's a mistake in the phone number, or all kinds of things that can happen. You want to make sure that the person that's listed there is actually available for questions at the time your press release goes out. Once you have a press release, the next step, of course, is to distribute it to get attention from people. So one thing you will do is you set an embargo time. Embargo time basically means this is when the news can be reported publicly. The reason you do this is so that you can share the news with your target journalists ahead of time, to give them time to write a story about it. So for instance, last week at IUCN, we had a press release about elephants in Africa and their red list status. Comes out on Thursday afternoon. But by Thursday afternoon, our goal is for the main media to already have their stories written and lined up. So what we do is we share the press release a week or so in advance with our target journalists with an embargo time, which gives them time to interview people, get the context, write their stories, and even put them into their system. And then when the embargo lifts, the story goes out. Of course, you want to make sure that this time makes sense for your audience. If your press release is focused on India and you go to Indian media with it, you want to make sure that your embargo time is sometime in the morning in India rather than middle of the night, for instance. Or if your main target is a weekly newspaper that comes out on Wednesday, make sure that the embargo time lifts on a Wednesday so they can actually use it. The most important thing, I think, to distribute your press release is to send it directly to journalists that you know or that you know of. And the thing that's important here is they should be relevant journalists. There's no point in sending a press release about conservation to economical journalists, political journalists, unless the press release is political, or lifestyle journalists. Makes much more sense to target environmental journalists, obviously. And the way to find them, I wish there was a magic, way to find them, or a list that you can just download somewhere. But this takes quite a lot of work, and I spend quite a lot of my time actually doing this kind of work, researching media contacts. You go online, you go on Twitter, and you look for stories of, that are relevant to you, relevant to your field. If you're in India, who in India writes about wildlife? What are the outlets that write about wildlife? What are the freelancers? What are the people that actually care about the kinds of topics that I work on? And you go to the websites, you go to their Twitter accounts, you try and find their email address, or maybe you can contact them via social media. That's becoming more and more of a useful tool for these things. And you slowly build your media list. There are these wire services, where you can put your press release up. You pay anywhere between $100 and thousands of dollars to have it distributed widely. But in my opinion, that's very rarely worth it. We don't do it at IUCN, and I think we would only do it if we had a piece of news that was either so earth-shattering that everyone will be interested, or if it's on a topic where we don't have a media list. But if you build your media list over time for your relevant topics, you don't actually need news wires. And then finally, press conferences. I think in 10 years of doing media relations and comms, I have been involved in maybe 5 press conferences, and I think of those, at the most, one of them was actually worth doing. Press conferences you do if you're WHO and you found the source of coronavirus, because every single media outlet in the world will want to know, and they all want to know at the same time. For us, for conservationists, for the kind of work we do, it's almost never worth the effort, especially not in person. Virtual is maybe a bit different, but it's very, very, very rarely worth the effort. And it's a lot of work you put into it. And you also kind of force people to attend at a certain time, which doesn't necessarily fit everyone's schedule. So of course there are exceptions, but I would say that more often than not, if someone suggests to you, let's do a press conference, probably a lot of things that we do is not news, but we might still want to have media attention for it. So what if it's not news? What if the thing I would like the media to report is our ongoing conservation work, let's say. In this example, that recently came out, nothing about this is news. A village in Ladakh was so poor that they took to hunting. Now they stopped hunting and instead they took to tourism. Setting aside whether the story is good or not, whether the framing is good or not, I think there are some problems with it. For the purposes of what I'm trying to say here, this is not a news story. This is called a feature. And a feature is any article that's kind of more in depth about ongoing work, where they present something interesting, but that's not necessarily coming out as a new thing that's breaking just now. It's not time sensitive. The recent Nat Geo story that Prasen did the pictures for, the cover story on snow leopards, is a good example of that. That's not news. It's a feature. It's a reporter going into the field with the photographer, documenting his interesting work. Another way of getting into the media with something that's not news is a commentary piece or an opinion piece. You may have seen this one by our friend Rishi from WWF, who is also, I think, the guy who took this famous picture that we're seeing here, or set the camera that did it, rather, about the snow leopard population estimation that's going on in Manga Bay. The key thing for this, if you're doing an opinion article, is that you actually express an opinion. And in this particular case, maybe the example isn't all that well chosen, because Rishi's piece is interesting, but it doesn't express that much of a strong opinion or make a specific ask. Usually a good opinion piece would be one that talks about something specific that's happening, like, for instance, why a proposed environmental legislation is very good or very bad, why it should be shut down or why it should be put forward, why a certain area needs protection rather than development, and you offer a solution for how it should be done. that's kind of the blueprint of how an opinion piece is structured. And ideally, you do that in a way where I, as a reader, who is maybe not involved in any of this, care about it. Why? How does it matter to me? That brings it back to some of these questions that we've had before. How is protecting this remote mountainous area somewhere in Ladakh or somewhere in on the Tibetan plateau, how is that relevant to me, to my everyday life? And sometimes the answer is it isn't. It's just about, protecting a species. But sometimes it is. And if it is, and if I'm the person you're trying to convince, make sure that you actually make that point, right? Now, the challenge, of course, is organizing or getting this kind of coverage. And the way it works is actually very similar to how you distribute your press release. It's all about relationships. There isn't a magic way of doing it. There isn't, obviously, if your opinion piece is written by your country's president, it automatically becomes more appealing to newspapers than if it's written by the CEO of your conservation organization. And if you send it to Mongabay or to the New York Times, of course, also matters, because the New York Times is not going to run a piece like this, but Mongabay might. So these things matter. But what's really key is that you do your research, that you find out who the platforms are, who the journalists are that could be interested in visiting your field project and writing about it, or that could be interested in publishing an opinion piece about conservation. And of course, we're trying to reach audiences outside of our bubble, but you also have to be realistic on just the size of the lever that you have and the kind of audience that is going to be interested. And then finally, you need to offer something, not financial contribution, but let's say if you would like a journalist to come to your field program because you think it's important for your targets that they report on it, you should think about how can we make this appealing to them. It's expensive, it's time consuming. What's in it for them? Why would they want to do this? And when you approach somebody, you ideally already have thought about this and you have a plan, you have a pitch. Like you know for yourself why you think they would want to do it. Because if you can't sell it to yourself, you can't sell it to them. Another thing that I would really like to cover here, and it goes to Justine's earlier point about building trust, is how do we work productively with journalists? Are they friend or foe? When I work with scientists, especially as sort of the media liaison person, I very often get the kinds of questions like, how do we ensure the journalist gets it right? How do we make them tell the kind of story I want them to tell? Or more concretely, how do I ensure that, can I read the article to make sure that they have gotten it right? Can I read my quotes to make sure they have gotten it right? At which point I would like to do a quick, I don't know how to get to polls. So I'm just going to quickly stop sharing my screen so I can bring up the poll.
Kustuber, I can help as well.
Okay, can you just
Yeah.
go
Yeah,
to
we
the
can.
next
Poll
poll,
two?
please? Poll number 2.
There.
Thank you. Right, please select all answers that you agree with personally. After I speak with a journalist for an article, they should send me the draft text so I can check if everything's correct.
100%.
They should share my quotes to make sure I agree with them. They should put the website of my organization into the article. And they should send me a link or a clipping of the article once it's published.
And they should include what I've told them to include, Matt, right?
Yeah, you can, I guess that would also be a statement that probably quite a few people would agree with. just take a couple more seconds to 3 people who haven't polled. Oh, only 2 left now. Well, I think the overall picture that emerges is pretty clear. Most of you agree with most of these statements, and that makes sense. It's a very instinctive thing that we would. I don't think I've ever seen lower rates. It's always like that. Everybody feels that way. Now let's do another poll. Let's do poll number 3. All right, poll number 3. Similar question, but a different premise. After a journalist has spoken to a representative of mining company X to ask them about the environmental damage and health impacts caused by the toxic runoff from their operation into a local river, should they send the article draft to the mining company so they can check if everything's correct? Should they share the mining company spokesperson's quotes with them to ensure they agree with the quotes? Should they put a link to the company's corporate responsibility website into the article? Should they send them a link to the article once it's published? I think we can see that there's a pretty different picture emerging here. And the only thing that has changed, the only premise that has changed is that this time it's the mining company, not the conservationists. So we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, or at least they're the not good guys. The thing though is, for a journalist, they're the same. Both the mining company and the conservationist are a source. A journalist is not a friend or foe. They're not our ally. They're a channel and an audience. And to them, we are not their friend or foe. We are not their ally. We're a channel and an audience. We're a source, just like the mining company is a source. Obviously, most journalists will, probably naturally tend to trust, at least the environmental journalists will trust us more than the mining company, but they shouldn't treat us differently. And so the picture that emerges here is much closer to the reality of what a journalist's job is. Sharing an article draft with a source is something that the vast majority of good journalists will not do. And actually, a lot of outlets have editorial policies that explicitly forbid them from doing it. And I think if you look at it with the perspective of the mining company, it's pretty obvious why. Because you don't want the source to be able to dictate what the story looks like. That's the journalist's job. The journalist, if they're good at their job, will of course do whatever they can to make sure they get the facts right. But how they frame these facts and which way they choose to look at the story is entirely up to them. And I think we can save ourselves a lot of frustration and a lot of misunderstanding if we get that notion of we will see a draft, we will be able to influence what they put into the story out of our heads. We are not going to see a draft, and I would argue we shouldn't, because that's not the role of a journalist. The only thing that I think they should do is send you a link. Even the quotes, if you've obviously, they don't have the right to misquote you, or to, I don't know, if you say yes A and no B, they should not just use half of the quote, they should use the full quote. But if you speak to them for 15 minutes and they choose to use only one sentence, you don't have a right to change which sentence they use, as long as it's a sentence that you actually said. So the reason I'm saying this, it might sound harsh, is that if you work with journalists, I would recommend that you don't approach them as an ally. or as an enemy, but you approach them as someone who is doing their job, hopefully professionally, in a way that is respectful. But the respect goes both ways. Just like they respect your authority as a scientist or as a conservationist, you also need to respect that they are doing a job as journalists. So their prime objective is to ensure that they tell an accurate story of public interest. They will work for us or against us. Ideally, they work with us. And kind of in the same vein, we often think of journalists as sort of our conduit to the general public. Right? Like we get the media to write about our project, and then we reach the wide world. And it can be, but the thing is that they're a conduit or a channel that we do not control. Their content, their delivery is completely in their control. Like when you write for your website, when you do social media, you control the timing, the messaging, the tone, the design, everything. The news media, you relinquish control. You talk to them, and the only thing you have control over is what you say to them. What they make of it is not in your control, and it never will be. And so when you work with journalists, I think of them as an audience, as well as a professional, a person, obviously, that you talk to. Like they're not, you shouldn't be afraid of them, but you also shouldn't expect them to do what you would like them to do. And if you think of them as an audience, you also start to think about what they want from you. How can you give them value? You want something from them, and they want something from you. Try to have that in mind when you work with the media. And don't be afraid; they're not out to get us. Very, very rarely is a journalist out to expose wrongdoing by conservationists, or to, I don't know, prove that you're exaggerating when you talk about threats and stuff like that. They're usually trying to tell the story as it is, but they're also not our tools to get our message out. They are people with a specific purpose and a specific need, and I think you're going to have much better relations with media and much better success in your media relations if you treat them as such, and you trust them as well to get it right. Because if you don't, if like I noticed from speaking with journalists that sometimes scientists can come across as a bit patronizing to them. And if you ask a journalist to send you a draft of the article so you can check that they got it right, just think of, if someone asked you that for a paper that you're writing, someone who is not a co-author or anything like that, but just some other scientist, I don't think you would necessarily like that. And I think the same is true for journalists. And so you have to trust them to do their job the right way. I know that's not what most people want to hear, but it's true, and it's an important thing to kind of get across. With that, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Just a moment.
And Matt, are you going to talk about how to avoid concerns that they misuse language or misuse your quote?
I would like to do that right now. I think we should discuss that. I would like to hear from people who have either had experiences or have that fear, how things went, and I think then we can talk about what you can do to avoid that.
So, I mean, just to share a little, I think there's been some controversy that's been happening recently. There's this movie called Seaspiracy, not a movie, but a documentary. I think that's been released on Netflix. And as a part of that documentary, they'd interviewed a couple of scientists and they've got quotes and they've got interviews, but the way they've framed what the scientists have said is completely in opposition to what they were actually saying, right? Because they've cherry picked the quotes and things like that. And the scientists have been really upset because essentially what this documentary is saying is people have to stop eating fish to for the health of the ecosystem. And they've gone and interviewed several scientists working on this, and they've completely turned it around to start supporting what they were saying. So I think that's one example of ways which sometimes what people say gets misquoted to go with a certain position sometimes, and that can often happen in media. And even when it gets or it's just misquoted. So I think that is what sometimes, yeah, one is the facts of the story itself, but the other aspect is because they're taking quotes from you. And even if they just play back the quotes, if you just read the quote, sometimes you don't know in what context it's said. So I think the fear of being misrepresented or your viewpoint misrepresented is very real.
I think it is, and I've read a little bit about Seaspiracy, and I think in this case it's really an example of unethical behavior by the filmmakers, because they're clearly telling a story that's not at all what their source was talking about. And in this case, there's really not all that much that the scientists could have done differently, because clearly we're working with someone who had a narrative in mind no matter what you tell them. And there's really not much you can do to avoid that. One thing I think you can do is make sure that everything you say to a journalist, even when taken out of its context, is something you can stand behind. If your key message, let's take this example, if your key message is that fish, like to stop overfishing, we need to end fishery subsidies, for instance. Talk about that and only that. Don't go into, yes, consumption of fish in Africa is a problem, but because you've already given the soundbite that they can use if they want to. If you're worried about that, make sure that you say only the things that you want them to quote. And I know sometimes it won't work. Sometimes they'll just do whatever they want and they'll find a way to do it. In which case, I think you can absolutely and should absolutely publicly say, this is not what I said, this is wrong, and fight against it. But what's also important to have in mind is this is an exception. Like, the vast majority of science stories are reported more or less accurately. They might get certain small things wrong, but they're not twisting the meaning of what was said. But when one like this happens, of course, it has a massive impact, but it skews maybe a little our perception of how often this happens.
Yeah, and Matt, can I just say, I'd go back even a step further, and when people are looking for who to talk to make an assessment about the media outlet at the beginning. Is this a reputable media outlet? Is this a channel that I can trust? Because many of them are reputable, many of them you can trust, and when they make mistakes, they are not intentional, and in fact, they may even be happy to apologise and point out the mistake in an article. But you have to be very savvy about who it is that you're even talking to, because sadly, nowadays, there are more and more outlets that are just looking to be controversial, to have their own opinions, to push a particular issue. So be circumspect about who it is that you're talking to. Do the research on that media outlet and on that person.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's key. And often it will tell you what to expect. If you're talking to the new scientist, you can be sure that they'll get it 90% right. At least if you're talking to the Daily Mail, you can be sure that they'll get it 90% wrong, and make your judgment based on that. And when it's a documentary, absolutely talk to them about the premise of the film. Ask to see, an outline or a thesis statement, or ask them who else they're speaking to. Do your research on them before you engage with them. Because a documentary, obviously you're investing a lot of time. This isn't something it's not a 10-minute phone call usually. So if you're going to invest time, also invest an hour or two to really research who you're working with.
It makes me remember another example in the snow leopard world was that program many years ago of Panthera working in Pakistan, I think, and they were depicted very negatively with their collaring work, Matt. Matt, we can see your screen, by the way. but they were very negative. You're on mute.
I see. Yes, sorry, I had an email that popped up that looks important, so I just wanted to take a look at what it is.
But what are some tips, Matt? Like, I remember Kustub mentioning one time to avoid video interviews if you're unsure, and having written words, which you have more.
Right. So I mean, it depends. Obviously, if you're approached by a documentary filmmaker to give an interview, they're not going to want a written statement. They're going to want you to be on camera and say something. And then you have to kind of gauge, is it worth doing that or not doing that? And actually, let me just go back to the slides, because that's basically the next slides are very much about these questions. There we go, speaker to write. So giving a written comment obviously has the advantage that you cannot be misquoted, because you have a record of what you said, just as they do. And it's good for very sensitive topics. Like if you get asked a question that for a print story that you know is going to be controversial, it's a good idea to give a written statement, because then you control what they can quote you on. They can still quote you in a context that you might not like, but by the way you phrase it, you have a certain level of control over what can be said and what cannot be said. But of course, that doesn't always work. Like if you're approached for a TV interview or a radio interview, or something a bit more in-depth, where the journalist would really like to explore a topic with you and have a conversation rather than just get a statement, that might not be possible. There's also advantages to speaking. Like, it's open and transparent, it helps build a relationship, and it also, assuming you're speaking to someone who's operating in good faith, it also gives you the opportunity to shape the story in a way, to tell them why a certain notion that they might have. You know, they might ask you a question that kind of tells you that they're thinking of it maybe in the wrong way, or they're putting the focus on the wrong problem. If you speak to them, you have a chance to actually explain that. And again, it comes down to the points Sibyl was making. Whether you speak or write, whether you go on camera or not, to a very large degree depends on what your research about the journalist and the media outlet tells you in your gut feeling. Is this going to be, a professional experience, or is it going to be someone who is going to just have a narrative that I have no influence over? And it's also, it's always good and always legitimate to ask what the premise of the story is. It's something when I link journalists to experts in ICN, I always ask, what are you reporting on? Sometimes it's obvious if you send news about the red list, they're reporting about the red list. But if they just come to us and they say, I would like to talk about poaching of rhinos with an expert, I will always ask them, what's your angle? Where are you coming from? Who else are you talking to? What's the larger context of your story? They might not always tell you, but if they refuse to tell you, that also tells you something about how they view the relationship with you. And it's probably a good idea to have your guard up in that case. But very often they'll tell you, they'll say, yes, it's about this and that thing that happened, and now we're looking into the background, and I'm interested in speaking to people who can shed light on this and this aspect. And then you can have a constructive relationship with them where you know what to expect in a way. I think the worst thing you can do is to go into it just without any preparation. Or as Ben Franklin said, by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. So if you agree to speak to a journalist, do your homework. Make sure you know who you're speaking to. Make sure you have your key messages sort of written out, that you can easily go back to them, that you know what you want to say and you also know what you don't want to say. And beyond that, there's really nothing you can do if they're acting in bad faith. But again, I think that's quite rare. And it's especially very, very rare in media outlets that you normally would have reason to trust. I hope that answers this question to some extent. If there are others, please bring them up. I think just given the time, and because this is, I feel, an important topic, I think it's worth spending our remaining time discussing this rather than doing an exercise which we can do, for instance, virtually at a later stage, or for those who are interested, I'm happy to do it, in a separate channel as well.
Matt, you've got some comments. I don't know if you can see the chat or you would like Christopher.
No, I can see it now. Yeah, I think that's a very good point that Kostub is making. Again, this is an ideal scenario. It might not always be possible, because if you like put yourself in a journalist's shoes, if you're researching a story and you want to kind of understand what's going on, you would much prefer to speak to someone who can explain and you can ask follow-up questions rather than just getting a statement. So sometimes that's preferable, but sometimes the only reason they come to you is because they need a statement from GSLEP. Let's say they've already written the story and now they just need a quote from GSLEP. In that case, if that's the feeling you get or the feedback you get if you ask them, a written statement is always the better option. Whereas if it's a story that is just being developed, I think it's a good idea to speak with them. If you're less knowledgeable about the premise, I think it's a judgment call whether you should decline or not, and the judgment comes down to why would I speak to them? And what is useful for me in doing it? What's the purpose for me in doing it? If you conclude that there's not really much to be gained from speaking to this journalist, and it's also not someone that you want to build a relationship with for the future, feel free to decline. If it's a topic you're not fully comfortable about, or you don't have the knowledge, or it's too politically sensitive for you to say anything comfortably, feel free to decline. Absolutely. The only time I think you should definitely not decline is if someone comes to you with something that's confrontational about your work. If they come to you and you say, we've heard Snow Leopard Trust is secretly being funded by poachers to kill snow leopards, you cannot decline to talk about that, because then it's even worse. You definitely need to get ahead of a story like that. But if they're just trying to get a quote from you about something political that you're maybe only marginally involved with, it's absolutely fine to decline that. And this is also, I think, an important maxim to have in mind when you do speak to journalists. If you can't explain it simply, you haven't understood it well enough, or make sure that before you give an interview, think through the topic at hand and write down how you could say it in a simple way. How would you explain it to your sibling who's not a scientist? How would you explain it to your grandma at a family dinner? I don't want to say how explain it to a child, because you don't want to patronize, but how do you explain it to someone who, who's a smart person with an average overall knowledge of science, but not a specialist? That's how you should explain it to a journalist. And that also, paradoxically, I find, makes it less likely to be misunderstood and misquoted, because the more complex the thing you're explaining is, the more likely is that they get one really important thing wrong, and then the whole thing comes out wrong. Whereas if you say something quite simple, it might not be 100% correct in all its nuances, but if it's simple enough, at least it will be used in a way that's relatively correct. So I think you have to kind of get comfortable with the idea that a media article is not a peer-reviewed journal article. They are going to get certain things slightly wrong, but that's okay.
And Matt, could I just add one other thing? In a way, scientists and journalists think and think and operate very differently. So scientists are about collecting data that over time builds a gradual picture. Journalists are about collecting information right now that in the moment on a particular day is going to give a fairly black and white picture. And often those two things are at the opposite end of the communication spectrum. There are ways for journalists and scientists to communicate effectively and to have meaningful communication relationships, but I think we have to remember that those two differences really exist.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really good point. And again, I think it adds to the sort of tally of reasons probably in people's minds why they shouldn't speak to the media. And I can understand that. But I think it might be good to, armed with this kind of knowledge, and like what Sibyl just said about the different operational approaches, and armed with your own understanding of why you're doing it, what's the purpose of your engagement, you're going to have these relationships. You're going to approach these relationships in a way that is much more on an equal footing, because you will know what to expect. You will know what not to expect and where the pitfalls lie. Obviously, we can't cover all of this in a short time, but hopefully it's a start for people to get more comfortable, but also to be aware of the dangers of getting too comfortable in these relationships. Do we have any further questions? These are just a couple of final slides on how you can answer questions, like things like avoiding jargon. When you give a written comment, especially, like, make it sound like something a person would actually say rather than a scientific journal paragraph. Use correct but evocative language, these kinds of things. And then a few points as well on what not to say. It's like never let them make you answer a question that you don't know the answer to, or that you're not fully comfortable answering, or you're not an expert on. It's always better, more credible, and in the end more useful to the client to answer such questions. I think that takes us to the end of both the slides and of our time. I'm happy to stick around for a while and answer questions if there are any more. I don't know if Justine and or Kostup have some final thoughts, or anyone else for that matter.
Matt, do you want to share with us the activity, maybe over email? So if anyone does want to do it, follow up.
So the idea was, if we'd had more time, or if I had done a better job of planning time, I think is the more accurate thing to say, to split into small groups and to work on either a draft for a press release or a draft for an opinion article about something from your work, a piece of news, a result from your work, or a topic that you think would make a good opinion article. And just draft a headline, maybe a lead paragraph, or in the case of an opinion article, draft kind of a rough outline of what the argument is and how you would develop that argument and where you would try to pitch it and get it published. If anyone is interested in doing that, I would be very happy to look at your drafts, give some feedback, get on Zoom and discuss it with you. Whatever's helpful and useful.
That would be amazing. So you can either send it on the Google Groups that Reki set up, or directly to Matt. You can send around the assignment on the group. Thank you, Matt. That would be firsthand feedback from you. That's really appreciative.
And just to answer Flavia's last point in the chat, yeah, if you decline an interview, you have to be prepared for them to go ahead with the story without your input, which, if the story is not really about your work and they've just approached you as a possible expert to talk about it, that might not be a problem for you. It might be a missed opportunity, but it might not be a problem. If the story is about your work, then it almost certainly will be a problem. So you might want to talk to them. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Flavia, by is it possible to participate as a listener?
To other people's feedback.
Ah, I see. Let's say if someone sends in a draft, it can also be a real thing if you are currently working on something. If someone sends in a draft and is comfortable to have the feedback shared with the group, then I think yes. If they would rather not, then well, that's up to them.
So, and we'll let you know if someone has opened up the group, Flavia. We can let you know through the chat. A huge thank you, Matt, for taking the time. It's been a really great session. I don't know if Kustub's there, wants to give any final words, but we do have Bedzad, who is leading the next session as well, if he wants to also add any final words. So Kustub and Bedzad, maybe if you guys want to end with anything. Kustub?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No,
You've changed.
well, no, I was feeling a little cold. I'm sorry. No, I think, hey, Matt, this has been extremely valuable. And I think, what a lot of us, people like me, who claim to be conservationist or a scientist, fail many times is understanding where the journalists are coming from, where the media is coming from. And this, this discussion that you led with, and especially those two examples that you gave, those two poll questions, and Sybil, your, inputs and your experience about having worked with newspapers and you coming in and giving those, I think it's been even though we've been talking about this for all these years, I think it's an eye-opener in many ways. And it's an extremely valuable toolkit that you're really leaving us with, Matt, or you're introducing us to. You're not leaving us yet. You're here for 4 more weeks. So 4 more weeks, so don't worry. But yeah, it's really, really very helpful. And thanks so much for the time. And yeah, we really hope next week we'll get into something more nuanced, which is photos. And I think that's where we will have more of the discussions that we've had with Sybil earlier. She mentioned about the differences between zoo pictures versus pictures in the wild. So yeah, I'm really, really looking forward, and it's very valuable for everyone, starting from organizations, government, GSLEP, everywhere. These are such valuable tools. Thanks so much.
Thanks everybody for participating. Thanks especially to those who made really, really great points and asked great questions and made this a bit less of a me talking at a screen type of experience. I really appreciate that. And yeah, if you have any specific questions or would like to discuss any points in more detail, feel free to get in touch, email, Twitter, whatever it may be. I'm always happy to chat.